Chapter 3, Unrolling the Scroll. Back on page 30 we asked, what does the sealing do? The next few pages were spent looking at issues that are just crying out to be proved by demonstration. And now we'll be looking at how the sealing plays into that whole process. So let's get started by listing off some basic information about the seal of God. 1. The seal of God, Revelation 7 and 9, is contrasted with the mark of the beast, Revelation 13. 2. A seal, an official sign of authority, gives the essential information, usually the name, title, and jurisdiction of the individual, organization, or government it represents. 3. This information is found in the Sabbath commandment: name, Lord, title, Creator, jurisdiction, heaven and earth. 4. The mark of the beast is readily identified as the claim to have changed the Sabbath to Sunday. So far, so good. The Sabbath is the seal of God's government. Knowledgeable and determined opposition to God's authority, in the form of Sunday exaltation, will be the mark of the beast. This is all normal Seventh-day Adventist eschatology, and on the next page we have these things mapped out on a simplified chart of last-day events. It's not the most complete chart of its kind, and it certainly isn't to scale, so don't make more of it than it's worth. But all we need right now is a basic outline, and that's what this provides. There are just 3 key things that are important to us at the moment. 1. The seal of God is placed in the foreheads of the 144,000 before the close of probation. 2. The close of probation marks the end of Christ's work as high priest in the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary. 3. The conflict between the observance of Sabbath and the mark of the beast reaches its peak during the time of Jacob's trouble, when those resisting the combined religious political authority of the world are condemned to death. Remember, diplomas don't get handed out before finals, so the seal isn't an honor for passing the test of the time of Jacob's trouble. But what is the seal for? What does it contribute to the plan of salvation? And why do the angels have to hold the 4 winds of trouble until the sealing is finished? There's a connection here, but what is it? The clue is in the name. How did Jacob get into this? Biblical names are important, and this isn't the time of Abraham's trouble, not Jonah, Jeremiah, or anyone else. So what makes Jacob special? It was Jeremiah who first used the Jacob imagery. For thus says the Lord, we have heard a voice of trembling, of fear, and not of peace. Ask now and see whether a man is ever in labor with child. So why do I see every man with his hands on his loins, like a woman in labor, and all faces turned pale? Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. And it is the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. Jeremiah 30, 5-7. Remember the setting? Jacob is returning home after his 20-year absence when he gets word that his brother Esau is coming with 400 armed men. This is not a good sign. Realizing his only hope is God, Jacob spends the night praying. At midnight, someone attacks him. For the story, we go to Genesis. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. Now when he saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip. And the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, Let me go, for the day breaks. But he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said, Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men, and have prevailed. Genesis 32, 24-28. For expanded coverage, we have the spirit of prophecy. The whole of chapter 18 in Patriarchs and Prophets would be good to read in this connection, but for the sake of space, we will simply focus on brief excerpts. While he was thus battling for his life, the sense of his guilt pressed upon his soul. His sins rose up before him to shut him out from God. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 197. The picture we get is that, while in the middle of a 5-hour-long fight to the death, the sense of guilt actually became the central issue. Guilt brought discouragement and despair and could only be resisted through faith in the promises of God. Notice the basic nature of Jacob's sin. The error that had led to Jacob's sin in obtaining the birthright by fraud was now clearly set before him. He had not trusted God's promises, but had sought by his own efforts to bring about that which God would have accomplished in his own time and way. Patriarchs and Prophets, pages 197 through 198. In other words, Jacob lost faith in God and thought he had found a better way to take care of himself. Sound familiar? During the patriarch's long night of wrestling, Satan endeavored to force upon him a sense of his guilt in order to discourage him and break his hold upon God. When in his distress, Jacob laid hold of the angel and made supplication with tears. The heavenly messenger, in order to try his faith, also reminded him of his sin and endeavored to escape from him. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 201. This is peculiar. Satan and the angel were both reminding Jacob of his sin, but one was seeking to drive him to despair, and the other was carefully watching the beneficial trial of his faith. The stranger placed his finger upon Jacob's thigh, and he was crippled instantly. The patriarch now discerned the character of his antagonist. It was Christ, the angel of the covenant, who had revealed himself to Jacob. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 197. And here is the crisis point. We may think it had to be a good thing for Jacob to realize he had been wrestling with the angel, but consider, after 5 hours of wrestling for his life, and no one around to impose International Olympic Committee regulations, what do you suppose Jacob had done to his opponent? If you had just flattened God's nose with your forehead, tried to take a chunk out of his upper arm with your teeth, and tried to destroy his kidney with your elbow, are you going to think he's happy with you? Jacob could either say, "Look what I did to him, he's got to hate me," or, "He could have killed me any time he wanted, he must love me." Under that kind of pressure and fatigue, what might you have said? This is no idle question, because Jacob's experience during that night of wrestling and anguish represents the trial through which the people of God must pass just before Christ's second coming. Such will be the experience of God's people in their final struggle with the powers of evil. God will test their faith, their perseverance, their confidence in his power to deliver them. Satan will endeavor to terrify them with the thought that their cases are hopeless, that their sins have been too great to receive pardon. They will have a deep sense of their shortcomings, and as they review their lives, their hopes will sink. Patriarchs and Prophets, pages 201 through 202. And that's not all. The worst is yet to come. Only once in all her writing did Ellen White spell it out so clearly. Those who live in the last days must pass through an experience similar to that of Jacob. Foes will be all around them, ready to condemn and destroy. Alarm and despair will seize them, for it appears to them, as to Jacob in his distress, that God himself has become an avenging enemy. Signs of the Times, November 27th, 1879. This is why it is the time of Jacob's trouble. This is not the same test the martyrs faced. Despite their suffering, they had the sense of God's acceptance and approval. Not so at the end of time, and for a shockingly simple reason. This test, in order to guarantee that the righteous are safe to save, must be the hardest of all possible tests of faith. Since the basic issue of sin has always been, will God take care of me, there can be no harder test than for God to obviously be seeking my harm. Do I trust him now? There have been foreshadowings of this test. Job is the standout example from the Old Testament. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him, Job 13:15, he said. And of course, in the New Testament, we have Christ himself crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Mark 15:34. It is in this path that the 144,000 are called to walk. When every sensory input is screaming, God has abandoned you, faith in his promise of love will alone prevail. Ellen White's account of the end continues, dangers thicken on every side, and it is difficult to fix the eye of faith upon the promises amidst the certain evidences of immediate destruction. But in the midst of revelry and violence, there falls upon the ear peal upon peal of the loudest thunder. The heavens have gathered blackness and are only illuminated with the blazing light and terrible glory from heaven. God utters his voice from his holy habitation. The captivity of his people is turned. With sweet and subdued voices they say to one another, God is our friend. Signs of the Times, November 27th, 1879. That realization, growing out of those circumstances and demonstrated by victory in that test, is what the angels are looking for. That level of faith will mark the 144,000 as secure for eternity. But what about everyone else? Now, at last, we can put the pieces together to tie off some loose ends that we've left flapping in the breeze. The function, purpose, or contribution of the whole sealing process is one of these, and farther back was the question of why this gospel has to go to all the world. And the answer is demonstration. But what does the seal demonstrate? We'll approach it as a matter of science. Among the most highly regarded of scientific experiments are those which are carefully constructed to eliminate all variables other than the point in question. When there is only one independent variable on the input side and only one dependent variable on the output side, the results of the experiment are very hard to refute. How about an example for the non-scientific types? Think about balloons. On the input side, we have one variable, the gas that fills the balloon, and for our purposes, we limit that selection to either standard atmospheric air or helium. On the output side, we have only one variable, the location of the balloon when released, and after extensive testing, we find only two outcomes, on the floor and at the ceiling. It seems like a simple experiment. What could go wrong? Well, uncontrolled variables could go wrong. What if there were a big fan blowing through the room? Or what if the air mixture were heated above the ambient temperature of the room? Or what if some of the balloons were made of some industrial weight material? All of a sudden it looks like we might get some confusing results. The problem, of course, is uncontrolled variables. God has a problem like that. Remember the heathen who've never heard the gospel? That's an uncontrolled variable. Think of the sincere believers who have never heard of the Sabbath. That's an uncontrolled variable. You can't make a crucial demonstration with uncontrolled variables in the experiment. So what to do? Simple, take this gospel to every man, woman, and child on planet Earth. Suddenly, knowledge is no longer a variable, and though it might be hard for human eyes to see it, that leaves only one significant variable, faith in God. Some people have it, and some people don't, and those who have it receive the seal of God. Then, in a stunningly nerve-wracking display of divine confidence, Christ announces to the universe, "These 144,000 are mine. They trust me. They've shown that in their respect for my Sabbath, and they understand this gospel." They don't know it, but they are now prepared to withstand the most hellish temptations that Satan can muster up. What's more, they will withstand the hardest of all possible tests, which I alone can administer. I've marked them with my seal. Now watch this. Then the four angels let go of the four winds. Chaos ensues, and in due time, God himself appears to be the avenging enemy of the only ones on earth faithful to his law. To some degree, they understand that great issues are at stake in their experience. In the midst of their distress, they realize that, should they prove unworthy and lose their lives because of their own defects of character, then God's holy name would be reproached. Great Controversy, page 619. What? One with the seal of God on his forehead who fails the test? The hypothesis of human redemption discredited? The omniscience of God proven false? The government and justice of heaven disgraced? Lucifer justified? Rebellion immortalized? To bear the seal of God is no light matter, not the place for the spiritually weak. Every deception, every threat and fear and bribe and appeal to human weakness and appetite will be brought to bear. Some, overwhelmed with consternation, will be ready to exclaim, "Had we foreseen the consequences of our words, we would have held our peace." They are hedged in with difficulties. Satan assails them with fierce temptations. The work which they have undertaken seems far beyond their ability to accomplish. They are threatened with destruction. The enthusiasm which animated them is gone, yet they cannot turn back. Then, feeling their utter helplessness, they flee to the Mighty One for strength. Great Controversy, page 610. And when it all looks hopeless, then, in some unspecified manner, God himself appears ready to stab them in the back. But faith falls at his feet and cries out, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." At last, they hear the voice of God announcing their deliverance. Only then do they realize fully that God is our friend. When the results are in, it will be seen that every person on earth with faith passed the test, every person without faith failed the test, and God accurately marked every individual with or without his seal. What does this prove? It proves that the 144,000 are safe to save. It proves that faith plus knowledge of this gospel invariably produces victory over sin. And it proves that God is an infallible judge of faith. Those last two items are crucial because they provide the rationale for dealing with that one previously mentioned group who don't have a special Satan falls from heaven event just for them. Who is this? The righteous dead. We'll use a hero of the Lord's cause as an illustration. His name was Martin Luther, and he understood a thing or two about justification by faith. But some of the details of this gospel were unavoidably fuzzy in his mind. As a result, Luther held to a few positions that would make us squirm today. Infant baptism, for instance, and predestination. As to his personal life, well, he was a German, which meant that his humor was a bit coarse, and his diet was worse, along the lines of roast beef, sauerkraut, and beer. And there were some troubling lapses in judgment, like the time he realized that the Jews weren't going to accept the Reformation. He thought the best thing would be to simply kill them all. Does Martin Luther sound like a good candidate for heaven? Really? Of course he's a good candidate. Jesus simply shows that the investigative judgment found Luther had faith in God. The other issues? There's no problem there. He'll learn this gospel in heaven. And the combination of true faith and that knowledge always produces victory. And with the evidence in place, Gabriel and all the host of heaven offer no objection, but rejoice that a sinner has been reclaimed. So, in the end, Luther had it right. Righteousness is sola fide. And lest anyone be tempted to think this opens the door to a cheap grace kind of faith, remember who is the judge of true faith and what is the test that confirms it. But what of the others? We've seen how the sealing and the time of Jacob's trouble answer the concerns of the unfallen universe about the safety of redeeming sinners. But there is a flip side to that coin, and nothing yet has addressed the concern over the harshness of the law that says sinners, all sinners, must die in the fires of hell. It's easy now, perhaps, to say, that's God's law, it's good. But what if the sinner in question is your mother, son, father, daughter, husband, wife, or friend? What then? Until the justice of that law is demonstrated, God has a problem. Fast forward 1,000 years. The millennium is over. The wicked have been raised. The holy city has descended. Time has been given them, and Satan has deceived them again. Now the decisive moment has come. At last the order to advance is given, and the countless host moves on. An army such as was never summoned by earthly conquerors, such as the combined forces of all ages since war began on earth, could never equal. Satan, the mightiest of warriors, leads the van, and his angels unite their forces for this final struggle. Kings and warriors are in his train, and the multitudes follow in vast companies, each under its appointed leader. With military precision, the serried ranks advance over the earth's broken and uneven surface to the city of God. By command of Jesus, the gates of the New Jerusalem are closed, and the armies of Satan surround the city and make ready for the onset. Great Controversy, page 664. Did you catch it? Something absolutely incredible just happened. No, not the army surrounding the city. That's what armies do. The whole purpose of Satan's last-ditch effort is to tear God from the throne and take it himself. Nothing unexpected there. The amazing thing is what Jesus did. He closed the gates. That means they had been open. With the wicked of all ages outside the city, the gates were left open. And as if to remove all doubt about what the gates were for, Jesus first resurrects the wicked, then summons the New Jerusalem, and in sight of all the wicked, he leads the righteous through the gates and into the city. We are not told what this means, and certainly it would be foolish to give anyone the idea that he could find acceptance with the Lord at that late date. And yet, the gates were open, and that raises a question. Would Jesus, the one who is the same yesterday, today, and forever, Hebrews 13:8, the one who said, "Whoever comes to me, I will by no means cast out," John 6:37, the one who has no pleasure in the death of the wicked, Ezekiel 33:11, would this same Jesus, Acts 1:11, let a repentant and trusting sinner into the city? It's hypothetical, of course, since in all the multitudes of the lost there is not one with faith in God's goodwill to venture anywhere near those open doors. Does Jesus invite them? We are not told, but it would not change the outcome. Just as the 144,000 passed the hardest possible test of faith to answer one question of the unfallen universe, so the wicked have answered another by failing the easiest of all tests. There is nothing more that even God can do for them. They just don't trust him. Destruction is the most merciful option. But first, there is the necessity for Satan's final fall from heaven. Next comes the final judgment, with its panoramic presentation of the entire conflict. With this evidence before them, every knee shall bow and every tongue confess the justice and righteousness of God. But, notwithstanding that Satan has been constrained to acknowledge God's justice and to bow to the supremacy of Christ, his character remains unchanged. The spirit of rebellion, like a mighty torrent, again bursts forth. He rushes into the midst of his subjects and endeavors to inspire them with his own fury and arouse them to instant battle. But of all the countless millions whom he has allured into rebellion, there are none now to acknowledge his supremacy. His power is at an end. Great Controversy, page 671. The conflict is over. All that must be demonstrated has been. Almost. One revelation remains. The scroll, front and back, must now be revealed to all. None but Christ can do so, and up to this point, he has chosen to do so gradually, over time. We have lessons to learn before all is revealed. The light we have received upon the third angel's message is the true light. The mark of the beast is exactly what it has been proclaimed to be. Not all in regard to this matter is yet understood, nor will it be understood until the unrolling of the scroll. but a most solemn work is to be accomplished in our world. The Lord's command to his servants is, "Cry aloud, spare not, lift up thy voice like a trumpet, and show my people their transgression, and the house of Jacob their sins." Testimonies, Volume 6, page 17. God had a knowledge of the events of the future, even before the creation of the world. He did not make his purposes to fit circumstances, but he allowed matters to develop and work out. He did not work to bring about a certain condition of things, but he knew that such a condition would exist. The plan that should be carried out upon the defection of any of the high intelligences of heaven, this is the secret, the mystery which has been hid from ages. Signs of the Times, March 25th, 1897. But when all is done, the ages are past and eternity is to begin. The scroll is to be revealed that, to some degree, we might understand the omniscient foreknowledge of God. This, too, is a part of his plan to strengthen the confidence of all his creatures, to further ensure that affliction will not rise up a second time. Nahum 1:9. There in his open hand lay the book, the roll of the history of God's providences, the prophetic history of nations and the church. Herein was contained the divine utterances, his authority, his commandments, his laws, the whole symbolic counsel of the eternal, and the history of all ruling powers in the nations. In symbolic language was contained in that roll the influence of every nation, tongue, and people from the beginning of earth's history to its close. This roll was written within and without. John says, "I wept much, because no man was found worthy to open and to read the book, neither to look thereon." The vision as presented to John made its impression upon his mind. The destiny of every nation was contained in that book. John was distressed at the utter inability of any human being or angelic intelligence to read the words or even to look thereon. His soul was wrought up to such a point of agony and suspense that one of the strong angels had compassion on him, and laying his hand on him assuringly said, "Weep not, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, hath prevailed to open the book and to loose the 7 seals thereof." John continues, "I beheld, and lo, in the midst of the throne and of the 4 beasts, and in the midst of the elders, stood a lamb as it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent forth into all the earth. And he came and took the book out of the right hand of him that sat upon the throne. As the book was unrolled, all who looked upon it were filled with awe. There were no blanks in the book. There was space for no more writing. Manuscript Releases, Volume 20, page 197. Where do you go after the end? In 3 chapters we have traced in broad outline the work of God in response to the accusations of Lucifer. We call this the great controversy, and justly so. But now what? Now we return to the real world, the distorted, artificial, superficial place where we live on a daily basis. Gone are the sweeping vistas of great principles and vast ages. Instead, we find the routine of jobs, school, bills, and whatever else. What does the great vision have to do with daily reality? How can we as individuals, as local churches, as a worldwide church, move forward with the Lord's work? How do we make a demonstration of his principles? These are the questions that remain, the issues addressed by the following chapters. Knowing that the scroll is not yet fully revealed, everyone should realize that neither this book nor any other by human authors will contain all we will need to know. But that there is a work to be done, a message to be proclaimed, is obvious. Perhaps after these 3 chapters, it is also obvious that proclamation must be combined with demonstration, that God's wisdom exceeds our own, that his methods alone will succeed. It is to the easily overlooked simplicity of the very methods that Jesus used that we now turn our attention. Our focus now is SOZO,